So, hope you're doing marvelously well. We're going to do 5 saturation tricks. Please subscribe. Please hit the notification bell and you'll know when we've got a new video coming up. And of course, you can go to producelikeapro.com. You can sign up for the email list and get a whole bunch of free goodies. You get free drum samples and some extra videos and some sessions and all kinds of fun stuff. Saturation is pretty darn impressive. You can use it to do something pretty obvious. Now, what it will do is it will control peak levels. Because of course, if you've got things like drums with huge dynamics, they can appear to be loud in one way because the transients are super loud. Like, let's listen to these drums here. Now, the snare sounds great. It's got some good snap to it. But let's just say I want to take that live snare top here. It's a little choked. It's cool, but it's a tiny bit choked. And it doesn't have a huge amount of energy to it. But if I was to just go and say get Decapitator, for instance, good old friend Decapitator, and just put a little bit of drive on it. Now, it appears to be louder. Why don't we check our peak value? So this is without it. It's peaking pretty heavily, picking at 0. Because that first initial transient with the EQ I've got on it is like slamming right at 0. So let's now put the Decapitator on it. Turn it off. Back on. It feels louder, but the reality is, if I set my peak limiter with the Decapitator on, the actual peaks themselves are 6.9 dB down. So it's like nearly 7 dB quieter on that initial transient. So what does that tell us? That tells us what saturation does. It's remarkable. So there you can see me using on drums. You could use it on any of the drum elements itself. It's nice on the snare top in this instance. Let's listen to it looped with and without. Take it off. Back on. It's not that subtle. I mean, I could bring it up to really bring home the point, but the obvious thing it's doing is it's keeping the characteristic of the snare drum, but it's sucking in that initial transient, so it's actually making the energy higher in the whole of the drum. If we were to just print that snare drum, okay, that's with the Decapitator on. Let's now print it with it off, and you'll see the difference. Turn off the Decapitator. Cool, we'll zoom in on these two now. And you can see the difference is pretty dramatic. Like, go here, for instance. Look at the amount of energy contained in this top snare with the Decapitator on. The whole snare is thicker, it's more inherent. And on this one down here, it's just like, you can just tell there's not as much energy in that snare. It's pretty remarkable, the differences. So, saturation is your friend. There you can see it on a snare drum working wonders. Now, you might say, while we're at it, but Warren, I see a little bit more bleed in the snare drum from the kick. Well, there's little tricks for that. We'll get to some advanced compression techniques. We'll do some 5 compression tips. Okay, but so there you go. A great tip. on the snare. And of course, you can apply that absolutely anywhere. Right, so we've seen what saturation does. It's fantastic. It tames transients, it gives more energy, more perceived volume to the actual signal itself, because we're not just looking at peaks. And one of the biggest things that we've debated, or had been debating about, is those peak values, because people are talking now about what level they should be printing their mixes at. Well, if you've got massive peaks all over the place, you're not going to have the headroom to be able to give the mastering engineer something he can really work with. Mastering engineers tell me quite often this thing they call fishtails, where they get these transients and this look. And it's usually from kicks and snares, but sometimes it's from bass guitars. So let's look at the bass guitar. Here's my bass guitar sound. It's cool. And if you know the way I do bass guitar, the DI is all the low end. You see all the high ends wiped off it. And the opposite is true of the amp. That's where I'm putting some personality. Now, we can go a little nuts on this. Let's have a listen to just the amp. And we can look at the peak value as well. It's at -3.1. I bet if we take off a couple of dB of that peak with some saturation, we'll get some amazing results. So let's go to harmonic. But I am going to go a little nuttier because I actually want to bring out some more personality. Soloed, you're going to think I'm crazy, but here we go. So. Wow, it's immediately so much better. So let's match the levels. I mean, the peak's -7.5, so it's already significantly quieter. Let's bypass it, clear the peaks, listen. Look at that. So it sounds louder and fuller. I actually turned the level down. But more importantly, listen to that. There's a little bit of noise in the track which I can deal with. We could put a gate on afterwards. But there's more high end, there's distortion in it, and which I like. Now put the two together with the DI. Take it off. All right, so we're going to get a bit, let's put a little bit more low on it. Back on. I really like it. Let's put it in with the drums. What I like to do, and you can do from here, is get a gate when you're dealing with distortion or noise or whatever like that. This Sounds amp doesn't have a gate built into it. So I'm going to do a quick gating trick here. So we can just go and get any generic gate like this. We can key it from the DI. So we'll take 19 as the gate in. We'll take the DI, send it from 19. Now, if I take the distortion off, put it back on, that little grit, that little tiny grit that's coming out of it is just giving it a bit more personality. So you get a little bit more of the bass. I'm just bringing the output on the gate up. Once you put everything in there, you don't hear the distortion on it. You don't hear it sounding distorted, you just hear it sounding fuller.
One more deserving of all the blame. I know myself well, and everything points that way. And though I'm clean now.
So you can see what's happening with saturation here. We're choosing to use saturation on a snare drum. We're choosing to use it a little bit on a bass guitar. And what is it doing? It's like incrementally improving things. I'm cherry picking things to improve. I don't want to go along and distort every single track, but do I want to add saturation to things here and there to improve them? Heck yes. And that's really what's going on here with the snare drum and the bass guitar. So on the piano, let's just try something fun. Let's go and find a different distortion. I really like the futz box, as it's called, and you've probably seen other people online using it and talking about it. So let's go and pick it up. What is cool about this is it's a little bit more than just a distortion. Now you can add distortion here. In fact, that's pretty freaking awesome. So that's the default saturation one that we're putting on the piano. What I like about that is it's actually maintaining some of the transients. The pop, 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 pop. It's actually bypass it. It's pretty awesome. So what it's doing is it's evening out all the sound again, like it did with the snare. It's making it a little less piano-y. Here's the original. Put it on. Now obviously the volume's gone up. It gives it more personality, it really does. Let's put it into the mix.
One more deserving of all the blame. I know myself well, and everything points that way.
Mute it.
And though I'm clean now, I can never
Back on.
change.
I mean, it's miraculous what that saturation is doing. It is bringing things forward. It is allowing it. This particular one, I'm a big fan of the Mac DSP because it, like I said, it seems to be quite magical that it's splitting the difference. I think their default settings have a little bit of high-end boost, which allows some of that transient to still be heard, but the whole signal's getting fatter and bigger as well. It's a really special plugin. But yeah, we tried a SansAmp, stock with Pro Tools. Decapitator, obviously you have to buy it. I highly suggest you try this. Bass guitar, it's great. I mean, it's a must on bass guitar for me. But here on a piano, you can see the exciting stuff it's doing. Number 4, let's go to somewhere really, really obvious. And what would that be? Well, that'd be like taking a DI electric guitar. Okay, so obviously a slide DI. Here's the amp recorded version. Now, I'm going to kind of do a double whammy on this. I'm going to do 2 things. First of all, I'm going to take this really beautiful clean DI and I'm going to whack a SansAmp on it. Yep, and that's just really, really ugly, isn't it? But I'm going to do you a couple of little tricks here that I do. So I'm going to take the SansAmp and I'm going to annihilate it. So we'll turn the level down because bit of a buzz there. We can fade out before that. Okay, so together. So it's cool, yeah, but let's do this. So now we've destroyed that DI sound. If you've got a DI or an amp or just a DI, you're gonna love this. Okay, so now I'm just gonna go and I'm gonna get a reverb and I'm gonna go mono, believe it or not, right down the middle. I like this because I've got a stereo delay on the other guitar. And look, listen to this. It's just great. So what we've done there is like you can find your DIs. You can do obvious things. You can put amp simulators on them and all this kind of stuff. You can just be recording a DI. But when you're in this situation where you have a DI and an amp together, your DI is another source of a way of manipulating the sound. It's about creating a whole sonic landscape. I discovered this by doing things like recording real pianos and MIDI pianos and taking the MIDI piano and smothering it with reverb, 100% effect, and putting it up against the real piano. And it creates this amazing ghostly effect. Check it out. Put it in. So it's kind of a double whammy, a little bit of a reverb trick there as well. But I love the Sans amp. It's on its own, it's pretty. I think what the Sans amp does for me with DIs on guitars is it gives me the closest thing, well, not necessarily the closest thing, but gives me a similar idea of like taking a fuzz pedal and plugging it straight into a console, which is something Jimmy Page would do on a lot of his famous solos, were fuzz boxes going into like Neve or Helios consoles. So I do that, but in this instance, we've made it more interesting still by putting reverb on it. But the reason why I like that sound is because sometimes when you're sitting there and you've got all these beautifully handcrafted, wonderful, virtual, simulated or perfectly recorded guitars, the Sans amp from a DI just slots into the mix. It just says, hey, I'm completely different. Listen to my tone. Because even that on its own, not very loud, but listen. So it's pretty low in the mix, but you can see if that was the only guitar playing, it's pretty special. But let's go back to our idea, put a bit of verb on it. So that's the wonderful thing about having plugins now. If we have a couple of different sources, we can really get carried away and have some fun things. You can split signals up. You can treat them in different ways. Like if you did have only a DI and you wanted to do what I did there, you could take a clean DI, put some, really disgusting distortion like the Sans amp on it, wash it out with verb, so you've got a completely different guitar tonality, and then duplicate that DI, and the other DI, you could use a beautiful virtual simulator. You could use Bios or whatever it is that you like to get a more natural sound. And then you can get something like I've done here. 2 sounds combined into one. Pretty tasty. I got so many other tricks to show you. While I'm doing this, I'm thinking, oh, there's a trick I need to show them about that noise, but we'll get into that a little later. We'll get into that in another episode. So here we got a completely different drum track, and the reason why I went for that is because I want to show you a little trick. So, pretty well recorded track. Two sets of rooms. Overheads. And I like the energy from this. There's some low mids I want to cut out, so we'll open that up. Let's get it quickly, grab an EQ. If you know me well, you'll know I'll go to like 350 and pull some of that out. It's a little ugly. It's also a little thumpy on the low end. It will compete with the kick. So it's cool. Okay, so definitely better. Didn't take long to make that a lot better. It's not too bad. The cymbals get a little carried away. So, one last quick trick. This is for room mics where you get unbelievable amounts of splash. And it can be because of, number one, the drummer. Some drummers are like, boom, da, dum, dum, shh. They're like absolutely caving in on the cymbals, but they're like, lightly playing their kick and snare. So you can get that situation. But it can also be the sound of the room. And lots of rooms, frankly, have a lot of glass or a lot of steel and all this kind of stuff. And so the high end goes absolutely nuts. So this is a trick that I learned years ago, again, using distortion, saturation. And what I usually do is reach for the lo-fi. So for those of you in Pro Tools, but you can do this with any saturation. This is what it's doing. So that tiny amount of saturation, listen to the cymbals. Listen to the hi-hat and cymbals. So the saturation is distorting the high end first. Another really, really good plug-in to do that, to kind of duck cymbals out. For those of you who remember and have followed me for a while will know I am a big fan of the MJUC. So we'll go to Dynamics. Here's the MJUC. This is another wonderful plugin. This is what I love. Drop this menu down here, and you see it's got drive here. And you can go dark. So that's cheating. That's not a saturation device only. It is a compressor with some saturation on it. It's very subtle amounts of drive, you know, depending on the signal coming in, but I like it a lot. I highly recommend this one. And you can go nuts with this plugin because it's got a mix control over here. It's good. In this situation, the lo-fi, I think, is a little more preferable. I think that the MJUC was a little bit more subtle than I wanted, but you can see what the reality is. That's another great thing about saturation, particularly in Pro Tools. If you're using Pro Tools, you can use the lo-fi. Now, you can do it with other saturation as well. But the great thing is you take the high end and it distorts first, so it sucks up that extra hi-hat and that extra, you know, cymbal bleed, etc. And when he's just washing away on the cymbals, but still allows that, oh God, the energy that we love from room mics, because, I mean, that's a lot of personality in a drum track. Take it off. Back on. Still got the, oh. Gow, gow on the snare. If anything, it's got more energy, more smack in the snare, more aggression, and yet the hi-hat and the cymbal have disappeared. And all I did was open up and default and put 0.06 on saturation. Now, if I use distortion, it will do the opposite. It will actually get thinner sounding. I'll show you. It's a little too brittle. It's all about using the saturation. Great. There you go. So there's 5 ways that you use saturation. But ultimately, they're all doing the same thing. They're controlling transients so you don't get those huge peaks. They're bringing energy because they're bringing the transients down, but they're allowing the energy of the track to get more, so you get a bigger, fatter, louder sound without those peaks. You get something akin to what happened when you always were recording onto tape through analog, you know, tube and valve for the English people, and tons of transformers. All of those electronics distorted, gave a little extra harmonics, and basically added saturation to the signal. Now, I'm not saying that you have to go through every single thing on your mix, but as you can see, I cherry-pick things like the snare drum was a dramatic difference on that snare drum. It was more even, it sounded fantastic. On the bass guitar, it added bite and presence to the bass, but as soon as the bass was in the track, you didn't hear that extra distortion, you just heard more personality. On the piano, that particular one, the Futz box, seemed to add a bit of air to it, actually had some top end, kept the transient a little bit alive, but also added some energy and made it so I didn't have to turn the piano up any louder. There's so many great things that you can do using saturation. So I would highly recommend that you get lots of different ones. The ones that come free, some cheap ones that you can download, just because you're going to use different plugins for different flavors for different things. As you can see, the lo-fi that comes in Pro Tools is really kind of cool. All of, Decapitators are an amazing plugin. SansAmp, which again comes free. These are plugins that give me different results. The SansAmp's a little bit more artificial, but with that guitar, it was wonderful because I took the DI and I can use either the DI to create a different sound against my amps or my amp simulators, something a bit more artificial like a fuzz box going into a mic pre, or I can use it with my amp sound, but then mess with it and stick a reverb over it, or delayed effects, or a phaser, something that gives me two different things to blend and gives me a more interesting guitar sound. So ultimately, there's so many great things you can do with saturation. And just using little amounts, often all over the mix, will make your mix bigger and fatter and just louder in general. And frankly, just better, because that's how everything used to be recorded. Everything had all those transients removed by, frankly, just hitting tape. When I pull up some of my old mixes, or if you, don't tell anybody, download some of those songs that were recorded in the 60s and 70s, you don't see this. You see big blobs of vocal, huge blobs. And that's compression and tape compression and saturation all going on. It's giving you that effect. And when everybody harps back to those classic records of the 60s and the 70s, that's what they're talking about. They're talking not just great performers, of course there was great performers, but they're talking about the things that were inherent in the gear. All right, so I hope that helps. Please let's have a massive discussion about saturation. It's a wonderful tool. And as ever, please subscribe, hit the notifications bell, and you'll know when we're bringing out a new video. And of course, go to producelikeapro.com and sign up for the email list. You get a whole bunch of free goodies. And you're going to get multi-tracks, drum samples, and extra videos. So have a marvelous time recording and mixing. I'll see you all again very soon.